I'd like to talk about some common mistakes in fly casting, as well as give you some tips about how to improve these. So I haven't really scripted this, but I think there's two main errors or mistakes people make when casting. I mean, I assume now that you have understanding of the principles of fly casting, and you know what you should be trying to do, but you're not necessarily aware that you're actually not doing. And one of this, the first one is this, that the rod tip should travel from one in a straight line from one point to the other. Actually, two of my tips today relate to that, and how do you get that rod tip to travel in a straight line to get those tight loops and as much energy transferred into the cast as possible. So the first one is that obviously if you want to get some power into the cast, you are in some way going to be using your body. I know some people maybe don't, they're more static in the body like this, but I like to use my body like this. But as soon as you rotate your body, obviously if you just don't adjust for that rotation, your rod tip will go in an arch like this, and that's something I see often, especially in the back cast. You can see that it's not traveling a straight line, it should be traveling there, there, and there. So what you can think of, obviously that you have some point over there that you need to reach at the end of the cast, and then you have another point over here, and it helps a lot to watch the rod tip, and if you do this, you will notice that your hand comes into the body and then it goes out again to compensate. That's the feeling you need to get for the rod tip to travel straight. And you can practice this at home if you have like the edge of the roof and the wall, that's a straight line, and you take just any stick that's maybe a meter of length, and you just slowly you move that rod, the end of the stick, so that it follows the corner between the wall and the ceiling. And what you will see is actually you get a motion something like this. So you have to come down close to the body, go up and away from your body. That's how you get the straight rod tip. The other thing that isn't mentioned that much is that in order to get your rod tip straight, you need to compensate for the fact that your rod is bending in response to the weight you're putting, or the pressure you're putting on the line. One of the points that is also very important before we go into this last tip is that you need to accelerate throughout the cast. And the reason for that is basically that if you start too fast, you will be bending your rod a lot, but because you cannot continue accelerate past that point, you have started too fast simply, then the rod tip will bounce up, which means that your line will be then traveling below your rod tip, and that's where you get these tailing loops. That's basically the main reason for tailing loops. So what you need to do is you need to start very slowly and then accelerate all the way to the end. So the most energy or speed needs to be at the end, and there's a few ways you can achieve this. One is of course that you start slow, because if you start fast you cannot continue accelerating, then you get these tailing loops. The second is that the most efficient way to get your rod tip to travel is actually this hand movement. This movement isn't as efficient as this movement. So there's this tip usually that you shouldn't be casting with your wrist, and that, for me, that just creates very bad habits, because then people will be very stiff and trying to cast with the arm and body. But you also need to incorporate the wrist. And because the wrist movement is really the most efficient way to get your rod tip moving, you want to save that to last. So you have your rod tip or your wrist kind of in a position where you actually can do this at the end, at the beginning of casting. So you use your body and your arm, and then at the end you use the hand. So that's called late hand rotation. And the same goes with the double haul, is that you want to save that all the way to the end, because if you're already there, you're probably bending your rods too much, and then it bounces up and you get this up and you get these tailing loops. So you need to wait until all the way to the end before you, and you can do this even when you're not distance casting, even when you're like just casting very slowly, or you know, short casts and whatnot. The other thing relates also to the fact I said earlier that you need to go up with the hand, because when your rod is the most bent straight at the end of your casting stroke, which means that it's also lower on the horizontal plane than if it's straight. That means that you need to compensate for that, and you compensate for that by raising your hand as you do this late hand rotation, and that will really give you those tight loops. Same goes obviously for the back cast. So you want to get that last power at the end of the stroke, late hand rotation, and lift up at the same time your hand. What else? There's one last thing I want to mention, which is creeping. And there's two ways you can creep. Creeping means anything your rod travel after the stop and before you start your next cast. So if you stop there and then you start your next cast from exactly the same position, then you have no creep. The most common creep is though that you start moving your rod backwards towards the way you're casting before you actually start the cast, which means that you're losing a lot of distance you can affect the cast, and you're losing power. The other way is of course that you go after your stop, you actually go creep forward, and then you increase your casting sector, and then you go up to stop, and then you let your follow with your hand as far back as possible, and then you do the next cast. Same here, creep forward, creep forward. So that's also one way to increase distance to your shots. Those were kind of the key things that helped me improve my own casting generally, and more like distance casting specifically. So I hope that was helpful. Tuleeko kalaa tänään? Yhtä paljon kuin eilen.
Ja just.
Ota, mä pitää... Noin. Yes.